Hello and welcome to another video, and welcome to the best books that I read in 2024. Why am I singing? That's horrific. I don't know where that came from. Let's not do that anymore again, Jen. No, let's not do that. So this is the video of the best books that I read in the last 12 months. I actually didn't think I was going to film this video because, 2023 was a terrible reading year for me. It was a terrible year. 24 just kind of continued. It started pretty strong, it ended really strong, but the whole bit in between, there were months I didn't read anything, and I genuinely thought, just off the top of my head, I don't think I've read a lot of good books in the last 12 months, and I don't think I can film a video. But actually, when I sat down to go through my story graph and all of the books that I have read, there were actually quite a few really good ones. They were books that I thought, yes, this has made an impact, I remember this book, I loved this book still really means something to me, and also, more importantly, these are books that I want to tell people about, and that's a really important reason why I use YouTube. So for all of those reasons, I decided, you know what, okay, I will actually do a video. I came up with about 15, but I feel like 10 is a number that we like to do for these videos, so I've narrowed it down to 10 books that I really loved, that I just really wanted to tell you about. If you've been around here for a while, you may have watched some of my previous year's videos, and you may know that I don't like to do just a top 10 in some kind of order, ascending to my favourite book, because that would be normal, that's what normal people do. No, I like to assign really weird categories to each book. I believe in previous years I've had like best lesbian drama book, or best, was it lesbian angst? I think that was a category one year. I can't remember because they're all arbitrary and completely weird. So if you've not been around here before, I'm sorry, you have no idea what's about to happen, but welcome to my best books of 2024. Let's get on with the first category, which is best book about a murder where the murder doesn't happen for half the book. If that's what you're looking for, this is the category for you. And the book that I have assigned to this category is by Lorna Nicole Morgan, and it's called Another Little Christmas Murder. Now, this book was first published in 1947. This is a book about Dilys Hughes, who is a saleswoman, and I'm sorry, but she had very strong lesbian vibes from the start. So I refuse to accept the last chapter where her and this other person who also gave me very strong gay vibes, where it kind of turns out there's a bit of a twist basically, and it turns out that they are in fact heterosexual, which is just not acceptable. But her car breaks down in what appears to be a bit of a snowstorm, and it's getting worse, and her car breaks down and she gets rescued by a man who decides to take her to a dark and creepy family home, which seems deeply suspicious, and I'm not quite sure why she did it. But anyway, she goes, but actually it's not that weird. It's quite normal. There are lots of people who are stranded, it's a big snowstorm, and then someone dies. Eventually. The death doesn't happen for a really long time. Now, the reason why I liked this book so much is that it had perfect pacing, despite the fact that the death doesn't happen for ages. It just is perfectly paced. It has exactly the right tone. There is a brilliantly slow build-up of the characters. There's a slow build of tension. I just loved it so much. I would say put it on your Christmas list for next year, but really, whenever you want a great crime novel, and I don't really read crime, but maybe like cosy crime, where the crime doesn't actually happen for a really long time. If that's the kind of thing that you're after, then absolutely put this on your list. I absolutely loved it. The next category, well, this is a category that actually could have been for several books on this list, but we're going to call this category the best book I read because Ben made me. Now, if you know me personally in real life, you'll know that at least 50% of the people I know are called Ben. 50% of the people at my wedding were called Ben. We only had 4 guests, so that's not really saying anything. But this particular Ben in everybody's life, not just mine, is Ben from Ben Reads Good and his Read Good Challenge. I have done a whole video about the Read Good Challenge for 2024 and my entirely queer 2025 TBR, so if you haven't seen that, I will link it below. But the best book I read because Ben made me was Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. So the Read Good Challenge, absolutely fantastic. You should definitely go and do this. But this is the book that I read for Annuary, which is to read a book either by an Anne or with Anne in the title. Kind of think it counts for both, this one. But I read Agnes Grey and I absolutely loved it. So this is the story of Agnes. Her family lose money and she goes to work as a governess, and she does this because nobody believes she can, and she is determined to prove them wrong. Something I deeply identified with so hard. But unfortunately, she has a kind of series of really awful families, and the plot kind of continues and unfolds from there. It was a perfect book to start a reading challenge with. Really easy to read, but also full of really kind of subtle humour, really vivid characters, an absolutely beautiful book. Cannot recommend it more highly. It is wonderful. My next category I'm going to call my best library find. Maybe my best serendipitous library find. One of the things I really love to do is to go into a public library and just peruse the shelves and try and find something that I've never heard of, by an author that I've never heard of, or maybe just another book by an author I have heard of or have always wanted to try, or something like that. It's a really low stakes way of trying lots of different types of books because it doesn't cost you anything, which is why I absolutely love it. So I do this quite a lot, where I just go into a library and I just spend ages just looking for titles that jump out at me, something I've never heard of, an interesting sounding title, an author I've never heard of. And I managed to do both with this book. So the book is Loyalties by Delphine de Vigan. I had never heard of this author. I really love French literature. This is translated by, I've forgotten, I think it's, oh, I'm going to get the translator's name wrong. I think it's translated by George Miller. I think that's correct. So I, like I said, really love French literature. I had never heard of Delphine de Vigan. This is the story of two young boys, the story of their teacher and the story of one of their mums, and it's told from multiple perspectives. I don't normally love that in a book, but I really, really love that in Loyalties. It's about secrets, it's about lies, it's about addictions, it's about really messy adults who are unable to protect themselves, never mind the children who are in their lives. It's incredibly short, it's less than 200 pages, and one thing I particularly loved about it was its portrayal of the idea that people see what they want to see based on their own life experiences, rather than what is actually happening in front of them, and then how damaging that can be to other people. I think it's a perfect book, and I cannot wait to try more of this author's work. So the next book is, I guess, best book that I read, because Ben made me part 2, but we've already had that category, and I feel like I can't have 2 bests. So let's call this best book that's actually 3 books. Okay, I'm cheating. There isn't 10 books. There's actually 12, because this is 3 books. And that is The Wolf Hall Trilogy by Hilary Mantel. So I did read this because I wanted to, not just because of Ben, but I read this for Reading Shame Forgiveness Month, because Wolf Hall is absolutely the kind of book that I would normally love, but I'd really struggled to get into it. And I think it's a perfect example of why, yes, DNF in books is really, really important, because life is too short for a bad book. But sometimes when you know it's you and not the book, perseverance is really worth it, because I loved these books so much. If I had to pick one, I would actually say that Bring Up the Bodies is actually my favourite of all 3. So in case you don't know, it is the trilogy telling the story of Thomas Cromwell, who is a man from a poor family who grew up to be one of the most powerful men in the court of King Henry VIII. Except for perhaps King Henry VIII, who might have been slightly more powerful, ever so slightly. So it did take me 4 goes to actually finally get into Wolf Hall, but once I got into it, I read all 3 of them back to back. Can recommend doing it that way. I think that actually any one of them can be read as a standalone book. I think that's the brilliant thing about Hilary Mantel's writing in these 3 books, is that you don't actually need to have read Wolf Hall to read The Mirror and the Light, or to read them in any particular, I mean, if you're going to read all 3 of them, you should read them in order, but if you just want to read one of them, I genuinely don't think you need to read Wolf Hall first. I think they work in any order. And I think that actually The Mirror and the Light, which is the 3rd book, because there was such a big gap in publishing them between the 2nd and the 3rd, it does read like it's written by a different writer, ever so slightly. It's a very different story, but it kind of works with Thomas Cromwell in that he's aged quite a bit, and he's gone from being maybe super power hungry to kind of wanting to cling on to power to actually I just don't want to die by the 3rd book. So I think if you are going to read them, my recommendation is to leave a bit of a gap between books 2 and book 3, because it just, I think, works a bit better. But I loved all of them. They are absolutely perfect historical fiction, and Hilary Mantel was just an amazing writer, absolutely brilliant. My next category of book is the best book about the impending destruction of the planet. a cheerful category. And my pick for this is Nuclear War by Annie Jacobsen. This is a book which I read as part of the challenge to myself to read the books on the Baillie Gifford Prize, which is a really, really great prize for non-fiction, sponsored by a questionable company. But that's for another video. I think the Baillie Gifford Prize, what they set out to do, regardless of the sponsor, what they set out to do is to give you non-fiction which is really readable, really accessible, really interesting and wide-ranging, and I think they do that. So every year I do try and challenge myself to read as many as I can between the awards, so between the long list being announced for the award and between the next year. I don't try and read them all super quickly. So I'm working my way through, I think I've read about 5 at this point, and Nuclear War by Annie Jacobsen is possibly, I'm conflicted at the moment. It's in my top 2 of favourite books from that award, but I wasn't expecting to love a book about nuclear war. So Annie Jacobsen is a Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist, and it reads like a work of journalism, but it also reads like a thriller. It is gripping like a thriller. What she does is she takes you from the moment that a nuclear weapon is launched, second by second, minute by minute, to the hour by hour of all the different perspectives of all the different people involved in what happens to the planet after that horrific moment when a weapon is launched from one country at another. And like I said, it's non-fiction, but it is gripping. It is like reading a really gripping thriller. It is deeply depressing and really, really terrifying and really, really scary. But I absolutely loved it. There were a few moments that I didn't love overall, but I don't think you need to love 100% of every book in order for it to be a favourite, because I keep recommending this to people and they keep telling me that they love it. So I think we're onto a winner here, and it is a really, really excellent book. Now my next category is the only one named for a person, a very special person to me, and this is the Thomas Hardy Award, and that is the Thomas Hardy Award for the best book about how awful human beings are. And this award this year goes to Han Kang for Human Acts. Han Kang was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2024, and it was at that point that I realised I should probably read some of her books, because I'd always thought that I probably would, but just never got round to it. But I read all 4 of her books which have been published in English, and I did a little vlog where I read 3 of those books, and I will drop a link below to that if you're interested in watching that. I loved to varying degrees all of her books that I read, and I'm really looking forward to reading her next novel, which is being published, I think, in March, off the top of my head, and I've forgotten what it's called, but that is being released in March, and I'm really looking forward to reading that when it comes out. So Human Acts is set in South Korea in 1980, and it is about a student uprising which has been violently suppressed. It is told from multiple different perspectives, which I've already said isn't a style that I typically love, but I really like weird books, and there are moments in this where it's being narrated by essentially the soul of a dead person who is searching for his body, and that's the kind of weird perspective that I can really get on board with. They are really like interconnected stories of kind of what has happened after this kind of violent suppression of this uprising. It is deeply moving. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I think personally, for me, it is her best book so far of the ones that have been translated into English and have been published, but with that caveat, I just think it's absolutely superb and I loved it. So my next category of book is the best book that broke me and made me ugly cry, and it is the other favourite book from the Baillie Gifford Prize for 2024, and that is Rachel Clark's The Story of a Heart. I wouldn't say that I have made people read this book, but several people on my recommendation have read this book and told me how much they now hate me because it made them cry so much, so I'm really sorry about that. But this is the story of 2 young people, Kira and Max. Kira unfortunately died in a car crash, and Max has a congenital heart failure, and Kira's family decided to donate her organs to Max. This is a non-fiction book, this is a true story. Rachel Clark is a palliative care doctor in the National Health Service and a brilliant writer. I think she handles the topic of this book so sensitively and so carefully, and it really is written with so much love and I honestly, it broke me. It completely broke me. I'm actually getting emotional just talking about it. I think there are moments that I was expecting to be upset, but I wasn't. But there is a moment where Kira's dad is watching the ambulance that is taking his daughter's heart to be with somebody else. And it's just an absolutely beautiful book. And whilst transplant in the UK is kept private, so nobody knows whose organs have been given to whom, the young boy Max, his family, they'd done a newspaper campaign where they had spoken about the difficulty of a young person trying to find a heart that is suitable for transplant. And because it was all over the papers, basically these two families managed to connect, so they knew about each other, which is why their stories could be made public and it could be connected in that way. It is an absolutely superb book. It's absolutely beautiful. I cannot recommend it more highly. It is completely distressing and upsetting, but I think really, really worth it. I would highly recommend it, and it was one of my favourite books of last year. Now I have another non-fiction next. I did read a lot of great non-fiction, and this is a book I wanted to include because firstly, I loved it, but secondly, I don't think I talked about this because I took a little bit of a break from YouTube in the middle of the year when I wasn't really reading very much, so I didn't really talk about it very much. So I wanted to make sure that I spoke about it. So I'm going to call this category, and I wasn't sure what to call it because it's down to interpretation, but I'm going to call this category the best book by a politician most people seem to hate. And I don't think that's true because I don't hate her, but it's a very divisive thing, I think. So the book is Let's Be Honest, and the author is Jess Phillips. I would also say that this is my recommendation for the best audiobook that I've listened to in 2024 because I just think it was a brilliant audiobook. Now, if you don't know who Jess Phillips is, if you're not British, or you're not interested in politics, or you've just forgotten, Jess Phillips is a member of the British Parliament. She's a member of Parliament for a Birmingham constituency. And I'm also going to look at my notes to read her job description because I think it's the best and I want to make sure that I get it correct. So she is the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls. She has worked her whole life in women's charities and is in charge of women's refuges. I would say that she's quite a divisive MP. She always speaks her mind. She often says things that other people won't. I don't agree with everything she says, but I do think that she is, in general, a force for good in Parliament. I think it's worth saying that she is the MP who has received the most death threats and online abuse towards her. And on a related note, how are these things connected? She is actually really well known for one thing that she always does every year around the time of International Women's Day, where she stands up in Parliament and reads out the names of every woman or girl who has been killed by a man in the previous 12 months. So this book, I guess, is kind of a part memoir. She does talk about her life and about how she got into the work that she does and why it's so important to her. But mostly, I think it's a defence of democracy, and it's a book which I think is full of really optimistic hope for the future of democracy. It's about how really awful politics has become and about how we can all and should all aim to be better. I think, personally, it's very, very funny. I think it's incredibly funny. It is full of really foul language, so if you don't like the liberal use of the F word, that is her trademark, and she is quite mouthy with her foul language. So if that's not your thing, you probably won't enjoy this. But she reads the audiobook, which I think is what makes it absolutely fabulous. And I really, really love women with a really strong, powerful voice using that voice, especially to speak out against violence against girls and women, and especially ones who are really opinionated about other politicians, which is also great fun. So I think whether you agree with her politics or not, I think it's a really, really interesting listen. The next category is Best Historically Inaccurate whilst also being quite accurate historical fiction book. I'm known for my snappy titles. So the book that I have selected for this category is Rosanna Pike's A Little Trickery. Now, I read this in December and I really loved it, obviously. That's why it's on this list. I knew I would. I found this book in a really small local bookshop, and I was on holiday with some friends, and whenever we go anywhere, I really like to find an independent bookshop and to support them by buying a book. And I'd sort of heard of this book and I thought, oh, this sounds quite interesting. And it was a signed copy that was a special edition for independent bookshops. So I got it and I thought, Medieval. I don't know why, that kind of gives me wintry Christmas vibes, but I thought I'm going to leave this until December. I did. I was right. It was great to read. It starts at the turn of the 16th century, and it's about a young girl called Tib, who is orphaned very early on in the book. She is a vagrant. She is travelling around the country. She meets many colourful characters throughout the book. The book has queer elements to it, which I didn't realise when I picked up, and I really love an unexpected gay character in a book when I'm not expecting it. Now, the main character, Tib, decides basically on a trick that will earn them some money. And this is very far-fetched, but it is based on a true story, which I think kind of makes you accept it a little bit more. I'd say one of the big themes of the book is about how religion, when people deviate from the teachings of the religion, how it can then be used as an abusive thing to oppress people. I think the book is completely farcical, completely far-fetched, completely ridiculous at times, but the voice of the character, the main character Tib, who narrates the whole thing, is one of the strongest voices I have read in years. I just thought it was fantastic. Again, I might have put these books together for a reason. If you don't like the liberal use of the F word, you probably won't like this book because she uses it extensively throughout. I think the book is quite accurate in a lot of the kind of themes and ideas and the ways that people are portrayed. But, and this really probably won't affect literally anyone else because no one cares about these things, Jen, but I did look up in the Oxford English Dictionary the F word, which came into use about 20 years after this story has set. That's like the first recorded use of it. So that's why I think it's probably slightly historically inaccurate, the way that this character talks. But I don't know, if you want historical accuracy from your medieval books, just read Chaucer. I don't know. It was really great fun. I really loved it. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. The next category is a category that is evergreen to this channel and very specific to me, and that is best book set in the First World War. And the book that I have selected this year is Catherine Arden's The Warm Hands of Ghosts. If you're new here, really quickly, just to explain what the hell this category is all about, as well as my many jobs in libraries, I'm also completing a PhD. I'm about halfway through now. And it's all about the publishing history of a very well-known, if you're British, First World War poet. So I read a lot of books that are set in or around the First World War, and I pretend that they're research. None of them are, because actually most of my PhD involves writing about things that happened after the First World War. At the moment I'm writing about the 1950s, but yet I still read books set in the First World War and pretend it's research. Oh well. Now this is told from the perspective of a Canadian brother and sister. The brother is a soldier, the sister is a nurse, but they're both on the Western Front in and around Belgium. And the sister has an injury caused by an incident, shall we say, and is back home in Canada. And she receives a somewhat cryptic message that her brother is both dead, but also probably not dead. And she goes to investigate. It has quite light touches of magical realism, just run with the weirdness, and it will pay off. It is queer, in the most glorious way. It is beautifully written, very evocative of the time and place. If you're really into the First World War and the trenches and all that nonsense, it's really, really great. I think it's better than some books that have been published recently about the First World War and that are queer. I think it's a lot better. But anyway, I just really loved it. It is on this list despite the fact that I hated the ending. I hated it. But I'm just kind of pretending that didn't happen because I think it's just down to personal preference. I don't like books that end in the way that it did. I'm not going to say anything, but I was not a fan of the ending. But the rest of it, I absolutely loved. I'm going to forgive it the ending because I think it was a really, really great book and I would really highly recommend that you give it a try. And that is my final in my 10 books that I selected. I think it was 10. I'm pretty sure it was 10. That I selected as my best books of 2024. I don't think I had a great reading year, but I think there were these few gems that really stood out and that really just made the reading year a little bit better. So I would love to know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, and if you want to read any of these books, if you have any suggestions based on these books that you think I might like. I think I read a lot of non-fiction last year, not as many as my stats would show, but a lot of the best books that I read were non-fiction, and that's really, really great. So I hope that continues in the next 12 months. Let me know all of your thoughts, as always, in the comments below, and I will see you very soon in another video. Thank you so much for watching.